Okay, so STS students, we are very fortunate to have our guest speaker for today, si Ambassador Jesus Domingo, our ambassador to New Zealand. And we are, okay, and he is known to friends, colleagues as Gary. So tatawagin ko siya Ambassador Gary. Okay. Okay, so let me give a I'll try to be as brief as possible to do justice to our guest, no, guest speaker. Ambassador Gary Domingo is our ambassador to New Zealand and concurrently is also our ambassador to the Pacific Island nations of Cook Island, Fiji, Samoa, and Tonga. And Gary joined the DFA after passing the Foreign Service Officer exams in 1990. And his diplomatic career in the Foreign Service included being assigned to our mission in the United Nations in New York, and then to Geneva, then to our embassy in Saudi Arabia, and he served as DFA Assistant Secretary for UN and international organizations, and concurrently as the Secretary General for the National Council for UN Peace Operations, and has been awarded the highest rank given to diplomats by our government, the Gawad Mabini, with the rank of Dakilang Kamanong, okay, or Grand Cross in 2016 for his work with UN peacekeeping and international disaster assistance coordination, especially for Typhoon Yolanda. Okay, he established the agency, the DFA's youth engagement platforms, namely the Diplomatic League and the Youth Ambassadors. And his areas of expertise in diplomacy include the United Nations, multilateral diplomacy, DRRM, and humanitarian operations, international security, peacekeeping, disarmament, and migration affairs. Ambassador Gary holds a Bachelor of Science degree in Foreign Service from Georgetown and a Master of Arts in Philippine Studies from UP Diliman, a Master of National Security Administration from the National Defense College of the Philippines, a Master of Laws from the Geneva Academy of International Humanitarian Law and Human Rights, and a Doctor of Philosophy in Criminology from the Philippine College of Criminology. And he also studied government and international relations at Harvard, law at UP, migration law at the Institute of International Humanitarian Law in Italy, and peace building in Geneva. Uh, he is an active reservist, a uniformed reservist with the AFP, uh, especially with the Philippine Marines, where he holds a rank of Lieutenant Colonel. But before that, he was with the UPROTC and is a member of UP Vanguard class of 1990. And he also serves with the Philippine Coast Guard Auxiliary holding the rank of Commodore. His military training is with the Swiss Army Rescue Troops also. And among his assignments with the Armed Forces of the Philippines as a reservist is with the Naval Reserve Command. And he served as Assistant Chief for Staff of Intelligence with the Marines and also for plans and AFP's Doctrine Development Center. He is really active in anything to do with promoting the memory of our national hero, Dr. Rizal. He's a member of the Order of Knights of Rizal, and he's the area commander for New Zealand and Oceania. And he headed the DFA chapter of the Knights of Rizal in Saudi Arabia. And it's been decorated by several royal houses, namely the Portuguese and Italy, with the Orders of St. Michael of the Wing and other orders. In his free time, he enjoys DJing, karaoke, science fiction, military history, model building, and cooking. And I would like to emphasize he's quite an expert on the Star Wars movies. So if you have questions,
Yeah.
even the smallest detail, alam niya. Okay. Okay, so he's my brad in the UP Vanguard fraternity, all the alumni of UP ROTC graduates. And so without further ado, I will give the floor to Ambassador Gary Domingo, our ambassador to New Zealand. So Gary, you have the floor.
Okay, thank you, Professor Brad Ben Vallejo. So, kia ora, greetings from Aotearoa, New Zealand. So, okay, so let's get right to it. Can we fire up my PowerPoint, please?
Yeah, here it is.
Okay, so Prof. Ben asked me to talk about Philippine diplomacy and Philippine science diplomacy. Okay, so before we start, can we go to the next slide? Let's first talk about three interrelated terms that tend to overlap, and in the public mind might also be sometimes mixed up. So um, what we're talking about within the realm of international relations, which is the study of relations among nation states at UP. It's considered, well, it's taught through the political science department. So it's the study of relations, interactions between nation states, international organizations like UN, ASEAN, and other international actors like international NGOs. So it has political, economic, and cultural dimensions. Foreign policy are the plans and programs of a nation state for dealing with the outside world, its international relations. And diplomacy basically is implementation of foreign policy by designated officials of a country. Like in my case, I'm a diplomat of the Philippines, but it also talks about related actions of international service civil servants, fancy way of term for UN employees, international NGOs, and so on. Next, please. So Apolinario Mabini was our first head of the Ministry or Department of Foreign Affairs in the first Philippine Republic. So I don't know if any of you visited the DFA, you see a statue of him in our lobby. Next, please. Okay, so what's the legal basis of Philippine foreign policy? So, of course, like all policies, we look to the Constitution, Article 2. So some very key points that we renounce war as an instrument of national policy. We accept international law as law of the land, and we adhere to the policy of peace, equality, and justice with all countries. And key is we pursue an independent foreign policy. And when we deal with other countries, we have to consider our national sovereignty, territorial integrity, national interest, and the right to self-determination. And the sort of enabling law for the DFA is the Foreign Service Act RA 7157, and it specifies three pillars of Philippine foreign policy: preservation, enhancement of national security, protection of rights and welfare of OFWs, and the attainment of economic security. Next, please. So those are our thrusts: national security, economic security, and overseas Filipino protection. But we also have to consider the another classic element of foreign policy, that is promoting our culture through cultural diplomacy. Next, please. So ano ibig sabihin ng independent foreign policy? It sounds like a general motherhood statement, but to me more concrete, and as enunciated by this administration, it means that the Philippines should be a friend to all and enemy to none, that our policy should be determined by the Philippine and not the foreign government, and that Filipino, not foreign interests, are paramount. And that had to be underscored because, of course, of our colonial history. Next, please. Now, if you look at the DFA website, we talk about 9 realities or 9 situations, grouping of countries, issues, developments that we should consider. And the wording of this actually started in the 80s, 90s, and we periodically upgrade them. But anyway, the 9 key realities is 1, the dynamics of the relations between China, Japan, and the US will determine the situation of East Asia. Number 2, as you know, we are a founding member of the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. So it is, ASEAN is a very critical component of our foreign policy. In fact, they are our immediate family. 3rd, Europe is playing a more and more important role globally. 4th, the international Islamic community is very critical, and to our Muslim brothers and sisters, Eid Mubarak. And also, it is instrumental that we have good engagement and to further the advancement of peace and development in Mindanao. 5th, next slide, please. So interregional organizations are increasingly important. Aside from the United Nations, we have ASEAN, we have APEC, for example, the Asia Pacific Economic Cooperation. And this year's session will be hosted by New Zealand. Then six, and a issue cluster very close to the heart and very much is the priority work of Professor Ben on protection of environment, natural resources, and our maritime territory. And as you know, we are together in the Coast Guard Auxiliary, and much of his work focuses on the maritime environment. Seven, basically that's economic diplomacy. We should really enhance our penetration of foreign markets and attract more foreign direct investment. Eight, international tourism is a major industry. And nine, overseas Filipinos play a critical role in our economic social stability as our bagong bayani. Now we have to add a 10th. Next slide, please. Crisis diplomacy. So increasingly, our people, our country are vulnerable to overseas conflicts, terrorism, natural man-made disasters, climate change, and of course, this ongoing pandemic. Next, please. So when we talk about the actors of foreign policy and diplomacy, who shapes them, who leads them? Well, first and foremost, our president, as head of state and government, is our chief architect of foreign policy. The Secretary of Foreign Affairs is his alter ego. He is the cabinet member in charge of the DFA, foreign policy. The DFA, of course, refers to the Department of Foreign Affairs, the agency in charge of foreign policy, our international relations. And when we say foreign service, we refer to the offices, the missions, and the people who are overseas from the DFA. So foreign service as a term, it's like saying, you have the Armed Forces of the Philippines, who is the operational arm of the Department of National Defense. So the Foreign Service is to the DFA like the AFP is to the DND. Next slide, please. Okay, let's talk about diplomacy. So can anyone, anyone recognize which part, where this picture has been taken? Anyone? This is one of the United Nations important facilities. Can anyone guess? Okay. Well, Professor Ben, tell them since nobody's answering.
Yeah, because it's the UN in Geneva. That used to be the headquarters of the League of Nations before World War II.
Yes, very good. Okay, so I had the privilege of working there for 6 years. Okay, next slide, please. So I have a sort of katuwaan definition of the start of diplomacy. So I'd like to say it's diplomacy, not prostitution, is the world's oldest and most universal profession. Bakit? It's in the Bible. Oh, is that sacrilege? Okay, well, just a little bit maybe. Okay, so why? Well, if diplomacy is about, well, first of all, okay, in the Bible, the book of Genesis, we have the first man and woman on earth, Adam and Eve, in the Garden of Eden. So diplomacy has to do a lot with treaties and agreements. So what was the first agreement between God and Adam and Eve? Diba, the Treaty of Eden, huwag niyo kainin yung mansanas sa puno, or don't eat from the fruit of the tree of knowledge. Now, if a diplomat is known to be a negotiator, a persuader, or convincer, sinong unang-unang diplomat? Edi yung si Satanas in the form of a snake who negotiated with Eve to break that treaty. So the rest is history. We violated that directive and we got kicked out. But, what does profession mean? I mean, how do you translate that into Filipino, Tagalog? Hanap buhay. You translate that back into English. That means looking for life. So we had a perfect life under the Garden of Eden, in the Garden of Eden, but thanks to the first act of diplomacy, we got kicked out. So you can say, in a way, diplomacy is a way to return to that perfect life under the Garden of Eden. So in the saga of humanity, we are now in the state of the Tower of Babel, where man is divided into different tribes speaking different languages, and we're trying to apply science and technology in building our way up to heaven, as in the Tower of Babel. So in a way, you could say the Tower of Babel could be the first instance of science diplomacy, science and technology diplomacy. Okay, next slide, please. Another way to describe diplomacy is the ability to tell somebody to go to hell, but in such a way that they look forward to it. So again, it's about well, it's being able to communicate sweetly, convincingly, even though the core of your message may may be a bit tough. Otherwise, more seriously, it's about relationships between countries and peoples and being messengers. So I represent the president and the Philippine government. I convey as a messenger communications from Manila, and I, in a way, I represent the Filipino people vis-a-vis New Zealand. So as all other fellow ambassadors do in their respective countries. The Archangel Gabriel is a patron saint of diplomacy because, again, he was God's messenger. He was the one of the Annunciation. He announced to Mary, "Hey, you're going to be a mom." So, and the fleur de lis, that symbol is also traditionally a symbol of diplomacy because that's the lily flower. It's not just for scouting or Alpha Phi Omega, but it's a stylized representation of the lily flower, which Archangel Gabriel is traditionally seen to be holding. When we talk about diplomacy, we look at three types of diplomacy. Public, which is about, well, the more traditional, what you normally hear about, diplomacy conducted by governments, which I do. Then there's also track two, which are non-government entities. So it's the private sector, NGOs, business, academe. And then three, grassroots or people-to-people diplomacy. Next, please. So other ways we can look at diplomacy, because diplomacy is quite complex, we could look at the scope. So you hear about bilateral diplomacy, that's with a particular country going one-on-one. So Philippine-New Zealand relations is an example of bilateral diplomacy. US-China relations, example, one-on-one. When we talk about regional, we're talking about specific geographic group of countries, like, for example, our dealings with the rest of Southeast Asia through ASEAN, or we deal with the European Union, which represents Europe. Then there's multilateral, which very technically means dealings among three or more countries, but it really refers to the work that we do within the United Nations and the international system as a whole. Next, please. Then talking more about track, again, there's track one among governments and government officials. So like the diplomacy of the Philippine government dealing with, say, the United Nations or other governments. Then I mentioned track two, which is non-governmental and private organizations, groups, NGOs, businesses, academe. But there's also 1.5, track 1.5, and a lot of science diplomacy 1.5. It's when, especially you see most active track 1.5 diplomacy when you have academicians like Professor Vallejo who engage with government on issues, global issues, for example, on dealing with climate change, with the maritime environment, maritime pollution, and so on. Or when you have, let's say, UP organizes a conference on the West Philippine Sea, and you invite people from, say, the Chinese, US embassies, and the DFA. That's 1.5. And track three, again, is more informal diplomacy, people-to-people diplomacy. So technically, when you communicate with, you make friends in Facebook from other countries, you could argue that is a kind of diplomacy. That would be track three diplomacy. Next, please. Okay, then we can look at the different types of diplomacy through activity. So again, and these tie in the pillars: political, economic, cultural, and consular. So political is between governments. It's about interaction of militaries, police, intelligence, legal. Economic, of course, trade, investment, agriculture, tourism, technology. Culture is about art, science, language, literature, education. Consular refers to the more day-to-day work we have, and most Filipinos or most people's interaction with foreign affairs is through when you have to get a passport, or you have to get a visa to travel to other countries to be stamped in your passport, and issuance of legal documents overseas. And assistance to nationals refers to when Filipinos are in trouble. Let's say they're accused of a crime overseas, we help them out. So where does science diplomacy fit in? Well, actually, it could be cultural. or it could be also economic. So it straddles many pillars. Okay, next slide, please. Then we have the different kinds of offices or missions of diplomacy. So mostly you hear about embassies. So long story short, an embassy is a diplomatic office in a capital city, like the Philippine embassy in Wellington or the New Zealand embassy in Makati. Then you have consulates, again, which basically are diplomatic offices in cities which are not capitals. So like you have consulates in Cebu or in Hong Kong, for example. Then missions are basically embassies, but not to a country, but to an international organization. So, for example, I served in the Philippine missions to the UN in New York and Geneva, and we have a mission also to ASEAN in Jakarta. Honorary consulates are consulates, but they're run by volunteers who help us out. They don't get paid, but they get a percentage of the fees they charge for consular services. They can do most things except deal officially with the foreign government. They can deal with the city, but not, not the main central government, and they are not allowed to issue passports because that's strictly reserved for DFA employees proper. Okay, next, please. So let's talk about the different categories of personnel. So FSOs, Foreign Service Officers, they're analogous to the officer corps in the military or police. So that's a career track where you start off as a vice consul or third secretary, and you work your way up to become ambassador, consul general. Foreign Service Staff Officers are our support officers, very important. They're like the sergeants of the AFP and the police. Then we have Foreign Service Staff Employees, which are junior staff, equivalent to the privates or corporals of the AFP or police. Then we have Service Attaches, a term we use for people from other agencies like DND AFP, DTI, Labor, who join us in our embassies. And political ambassadors are a certain kind of ambassador who are basically people who are appointed right away to serve as ambassador by the president. But I am not a political ambassador. I'm a career ambassador. I started as an FSO and I worked my way up. Next, please. Okay, so some of these concepts you keep hearing about in relation to diplomacy. There's immunities and privileges. Basically, this is a courtesy extended to diplomats, basically meaning that we are exempt from the criminal jurisdiction and taxation of the host country. So theoretically, I could kill somebody in DFA. In New Zealand. Would I get arrested? They're not supposed to arrest me, but it would still cause problems. But again, I would not be arrested. And yes, we generally do not pay. We don't have to pay, of course, income tax. We have to pay sales tax, but in other countries, like in Geneva, we have to pay sales tax, but we get a refund. Diplomatic corps is a term referring to the foreign ambassadors in a given city, like the American, Canadian, and all the other foreign ambassadors who are in Manila are part of the diplomatic corps of Manila, as I am part of the diplomatic corps of Wellington. One of the key activities of embassies is to hold a National Day reception, like June 12 or July 4 for the Americans. Next, please. So I have the title His Excellency, female ambassadors be Her Excellency, because we are the alter ego of the president, of the head of state. AEP, Ambassador Extraordinary and Plenipotentiary, the reason why you have extraordinary and plenipotentiary tacked on, it means we really represent the country and we really represent the head of state. Because you could have officers with the title of ambassador, but are not necessarily AEP, because they're there, but they don't necessarily represent. Their task is not the representation of country, but they would have a specific task, whether it's political or economic or cultural. Now, when you say embassy, there's the office of our diplomatic office, but it can refer to two things. One is the Chancery, which is the working business office, And then there's the residence, the home of the ambassador. And later I'll show you pictures of our Chancery in residence here in New Zealand. Presentation of credentials is a ceremony where you present your letter from the president saying, hey, hey, Gary's the ambassador, so please let him do his job. And there's a ceremony for that. Order of precedence. So in the diplomatic corps, you have a seniority. In countries, yeah, the most senior is become the dean or the coordinator. But in countries with a heavy Catholic influence, like the Philippines, whoever is the ambassador or the representative of the Vatican is traditionally the head of the diplomatic corps. Anyway, the one who's the most senior in order of precedence gets to be the dean. Otherwise, and that seniority is based on the date you presented your credentials. And I'll show you pictures from my ceremony. Next, please. So treaties, again, are formal agreements, written agreements between countries, but they require ratification from the legislature. Executive agreements are agreements, but they don't require ratification. So they usually are a little less detailed than treaties. MOUs or MOAs are even less formal form of agreements. And yeah, UP does all sorts of MOUs, MOAs with other universities. Also, the government does with other governments, other countries. Note verbal is our standard format of written communication. It's a certain format of a letter that like, for example, I want to communicate with the New Zealand government. I do it in what we call a note verbal. An aide memoir is our term for recorded minutes of a meeting, and that also has a certain format. Next, please. So the legal basis for diplomatic immunities and privileges is in a treaty called the Vienna Convention on Diplomatic Relations, signed in 1961. There's also a convention on consular relations. So what is the convention and what are the immunities and privileges all about? Again, diplomats are given certain legal exemptions, again, from basically taxation. The embassy, the residence and Chancery considered national territory. So, police can't just come in unless, we give them permission. The diplomatic pouch is literally a pouch or a bag containing documents that we send from, let's say, Manila to Wellington, and they're not supposed to be opened because they would carry confidential material. And again, we're generally immune from suit. However, like what happened is, like, theoretically, if I shot somebody, I won't be arrested. However, in order to preserve good relations, the Philippine government might revoke my immunities and privileges, and I would have to stand trial, or the host government can kick out the diplomats by declaring them persona non grata, revoking their immunity, expelling them, but they're given, like, let's say 24 or 40 hours to leave the country, but otherwise they're not hassled. They just have to leave the country. Okay. Next, please. Then again, I think many of you have had passports, which are booklets proving you're a citizen of a country, but they are the property of the government, so you can't just do anything you want with them. And the government could theoretically revoke it at any time. A visa is a permission to enter a country, indicating the passport. It could be a sticker or could be a stamp. Assistance to nationals, or ATN, is our term for the services, the assistance we give to Filipinos in trouble, like if they need legal assistance or they're in jail, we visit them and help try to get them out, that sort of thing. Again, honorary consuls are unpaid volunteers heading an honorary consulate. Usually they are lawyers or wealthy businessmen who can afford to give us office. Well, they would work to help us with issue documentation like notarials and that sort of thing. What do they get out of it? Well, there's a prestige to being an honorary consul. And again, consuls have immunities and privileges, but not as extensively as diplomats assigned to capital cities. Next, please. So we have there our building, the Department of Foreign Affairs in Pasay. That used to be the building of the Asian Development Bank before they moved off to Pasig. Next, please. So this is the organigram of the DFA. So you see we have quite a number of offices. This is slightly obsolete, but more or less it says there. So our working wings are under the Undersecretary for Administration and then Policy. So I report to the Office of Asia Pacific Affairs, who handles the embassies and consulates in the Asia Pacific region, as American Affairs handles our missions in North and South America, and so on. Okay, next slide, please. So in all, we have, we have 62 embassies, 24 consulates general, and 4 permanent missions to international organizations all over the world. But sometimes an embassy would do double duty, where, let's say, like, for example, my case, I'm in New Zealand, but I also am the Philippine ambassador to Fiji, Samoa, Tonga, Cook Islands. So that means I'm based here in Wellington, but I have to travel to those countries at least once a year. Okay. And again, consulates generals are offices in places which are not the capital cities. Like, for example, we have consulates general in Los Angeles, Chicago, Frankfurt, Hong Kong, Nagoya, Osaka, and Sydney. Okay, next, please. So what do we do day to day in the embassy? Well, one, we promote political, economic, and cultural relations with the host country. We protect the rights and welfare of OFW. So in New Zealand, we have 80,000 Filipinos, but already about more than half are already New Zealand citizens or permanent residents. And many of those citizens, though, have become also Philippine dual New Zealand and Philippine citizens. And this is actually the most important, the priority pillar of our diplomacy, of our foreign policy. And part of that is assisting distressed overseas Filipinos. We support the Filipino community's activities, like we have all these upcoming June 12 activities, we have the quincentennial activities, sports and beauty pageants, all those sort of things. We promote Filipino products, services, tourism, and investment. We project a positive image of the Philippines and Filipino people. We issue and renew passports, visas, and other legal documentation. We receive reports of birth, marriage, and death. And yes, like, for example, if you're a Philippine citizen, you have your children born overseas, you get married overseas, you die overseas, you need to report it to us, because that's how it gets inputted in the NSO database of the Philippines. And we conduct overseas absentee voting. And of course, next year we'll be very busy administering it. And as you know, overseas voting can be done either in ballot or it has to be in person. So here in New Zealand and the Pacific Islands, it's by mail. But here in the embassy, we are the canvassing polling station, and we have to count the votes. Okay, then we also take care of shipment of remains. If you die, we help you get home. Okay, so please don't die. All right, next, please. So we are guided by a concept called one country team approach, where we, so again, DFA is mainly run by, embassies and consulates are mainly run by the DFA. Most of the personnel are from DFA, but we do have colleagues from other government agencies who we generally call attaches, who work with us, like from DND AFP, DILG, PNP, DTI, DOLE, OWA, Tourism, Agriculture, DSWD, NICA, and Coast Guard. Of course, they're not in all embassies. They're just in some. In my case, I have an attaché and an office from the Department of Labor, OWA, which we call the POLO, Philippine Overseas Labor Office. I have attachés who are assigned to me from DTI, Tourism, and DND AFP, but they're based in Australia, and I have to share them with Australia. Our embassy in Canberra, Australia. But nevertheless, they assist us in our mission of promoting Philippine interests. Next, please. So this is what our embassy looks like. So the blue boxes are DFA people, and the colored ones are from other agencies. So again, I'm the ambassador, I have a secretary, I have a deputy, and my other personnel are assigned to the different sections. And again, we have I have a defense attaché, but he's in Canberra. I have trade and tourism attachés, but they're based in Sydney, but I have my own labor attaché. Next, please. So now let's talk about science diplomacy. So let's talk about definitions and what Philippine science diplomacy is all about. Okay, next slide, please. So how do we define science diplomacy? So on one hand, it's about using science as a tool to achieve foreign policy objectives and to promote sustainable peace and sustainable development. Also, it means the use of scientific, technological, and academic collaborations among countries, regions, societies to address common interests, common issues, and to build sound international partnerships. So there is a bilateral dimension, a regional dimension, and a multilateral dimension, like all facets of foreign policy. Next, please. Sometimes science diplomacy is also referred to as innovation diplomacy, technology or tech diplomacy, STI, science, technology, innovation diplomacy, or sci-tech diplomacy. And again, there are two lenses where we could look at it. Its scope can be about cooperation, collaboration with the world as a whole, international collaboration, or it's about our own Philippine national interests and how we advance them. Next, please. So we could talk about the strands of science diplomacy, science in diplomacy, meaning where scientific know-how and evidence is used to inform and support foreign policy objectives. We have diplomacy for science, where diplomatic efforts and resources are aimed at facilitating international scientific and technical cooperation. And third, science for diplomacy, where science cooperation is used as a source of soft power to strengthen or foster foreign relations. So you've heard this term soft power. Well, that's contrast with hard power. So hard power is more use of the military or you've heard of gunboat diplomacy, for example. But soft power is more benign, referring again more to culture, to science, to art. Okay, so let's give it a sample of a certain type of science diplomacy using this three-strand approach. Next, please. So much of the involvement of DFA, or the Philippine scientific community, and the top priority for the world is action on climate change. So how does that work? Okay, so we talk about the science and diplomacy aspect of climate change is when scientific measurement will be used to monitor progress against various agreements. For example, like when we monitor our carbon emissions, for example, our energy consumption, and so on. Then there's diplomacy for science, where diplomacy was needed to establish and sustain the process associated with the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which is the key operational wing of our whole global process on climate change, which is through the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, UNFCCC. And we have many of our fellow ISCO and ISCA very well represented in our whole of society approach, government and academe, as we work with the rest of the world on climate change adaptation and mitigation. Then there's science for diplomacy, where international scientific cooperation was used and needed to advance our understandings of the global climate system and to facilitate international agreements. Okay, next please. So DFA does have a role in science diplomacy, and there's an aspect of science when we deal with the United Nations, multilateral, and the regional dimension when we deal with ASEAN, and bilateral. Like, yes, there is scientific cooperation between us and New Zealand, us and the United States, us and China, and so on. But of course, our lead government agency on science, and therefore science diplomacy, is DOST. They have an ASEC for international cooperation. DOST used to have science attaches in Tokyo and in Washington, D.C. Then, of course, other agencies like NEDA, Agriculture, Health, Information Communications Technology, and so on, also are involved in promoting science diplomacy. And the heart of science diplomacy activity is forging bilateral scientific cooperation agreements between specific countries on research collaboration, sharing of information, exchange of people, sharing of publications. Of course, UP itself as track 1.5, track 2, or track 3 diplomacy also have their collaborations with the UN system, with other universities, other countries, and of course other institutions and civil society in the Philippines. But we're proud that UP is very much taking the lead. Graduates of UP are taking the lead in Philippine science diplomacy. Next, please. Now, DOST basically, again, looks at advancing science and technology and information diplomacy through bilateral and multilateral collaboration. So let's look at the bottom part. So bilaterally, we build partnerships with other countries, joint R&D, exchange of scientists, building research networks, joint seminars and workshops, where Professor Ben and other UP colleagues have been very active in, and well, all these activities, tech transfer, capacity building. So yes, I think many of the laboratories or facilities of the College of Science and other UP units have been done in cooperation and with the assistance of international partners. Then when we look at our standing on STI and the international community and the world, we exchange, we promote international activities, and we disseminate information and so on, so forth. And look at the right side, we contribute tangibly to solving global issues and mutual issues, such as, again, climate change, DRM, and food security, of course, this current research and action on the pandemic, global health, and so on. So as you know, DOST has various councils, R&D institutes and services and so on, part of the DOST family, which of course UP is closely working with. Next, please. So these are among the priority countries where DOST have bilateral agreements or are forging agreements. Okay, and glad to see, of course, New Zealand is among the top 20 priority countries. Next, please. So, of course, we deal with ASEAN, UN, APEC, EU, the CG system, which is on agricultural research. Next, please. So here is a list of the various treaties, projects, agreements, agencies, and so on, where Filipinos or the Philippines are very active in. And we do have many ISCO and ISCA actually working with the UN Secretariat or these various particular processes on the SDGs, Biodiversity Convention, climate change, UNDP, disaster risk reduction, outer space, health, agriculture, ITU, yeah, and so on and so forth, including, and these are all over the world, New York, Vienna, Paris, Africa, Asia, and so on. So quite a range. And so perhaps you students could very well consider careers in the United Nations and the global scientific community. Next, please. Also on the regional, we have a very active menu of cooperation with our fellow ASEAN countries through the ASEAN Committee on Science and Technology and areas of cooperation. And so this could give you a cue as to where your particular majors in UP could be of great help. There's food science and technology, biotechnology, meteorology and geophysics, marine science and technology, non-conventional energy research, microelectronics information technology, material science technology, space technology, S&T infrastructure, and so on. Next, please. So this is me as in my privileged opportunities to work with the scientific community. So the top left is when I was in the climate change conference in Lima, Peru in 2014. Then going clockwise, I was in the Paris Climate Conference, December 2015. And so two pictures there. And then finally in the bottom left was in the Disaster Risk Reduction World Conference in Sendai, Japan, also in 2015. Next, please. So going back to my life here in New Zealand, so there I'm with one of the top government leaders of the world, the Prime Minister of New Zealand, Jacinda Ardern. So this was taken last January at the opening of the New Zealand Parliament. Next, please. So this is our Chancery, our working office. So you see the circular doors, very much reflecting the Hobbit hovels of the Lord of the Rings, which is, as you know, filmed in New Zealand. Next, please. And this is the residence where I am actually now. It's a lovely old mansion built in the 1900s. Pero napakalamig, because when it was built, they didn't really believe in central heating. They had fireplaces. Next, please. So this is my ceremony of the presidential credentials. So the top pictures um, reflect the Katutubo, or native Maori culture. So the top left, a warrior comes out and he drops an arrowhead, and if I pick it up, that means I come in peace. Then the top right is the hongi, or the traditional Maori greeting of the touching of noses, exchanging our souls and spirits through our breath. And the bottom part is the more traditional aspects of presentation credentials. So bottom left is the review of the honor guard from the New Zealand Army. And bottom right is my meeting with the head of state, who's not the prime minister, but the head of state is Queen Elizabeth, and represented by a governor general, but who's a New Zealander. So this was Sir Jerry Mataparai, who was former head of the New Zealand Defense Force. He was the Governor General. Then he was assigned as their High Commissioner Ambassador to London. Now he's back here in New Zealand. Next, please. So here's some shots of DFA in action. On the left is our action regarding Iraq, Baghdad, assisting OFWs. On the right, also our cultural activities, where we're teaching Filipino language and culture to elementary school children in Wellington, New Zealand. And all our other DFA personnel there and friends are also ISCO and ISCA. Next, please. So here's a shot of how we're coping with COVID. So as you see on the top middle, part of the job of a diplomat, of ambassadors, to speak with media. So from time to time, I'm interviewed by, let's say, PTV4 or various radio stations, Radio Bombo, the Tulfo Brothers, you name it. I've appeared in it. So these are shots of how we are doing our social distancing, our face masks and face shields wearing, and so forth in the embassy. Next, please. Okay, so I've distilled the lessons I've learned looking at the best of Filipino values as well as New Zealand values. And I've come up with a framework called the Way of the Sun. And I'd like to say that everyone is a potential diplomat, and becoming a son is the best person you can be. And this is the title of my forthcoming book, but distilling my exposure as a diplomat and also representing the Philippines and Filipino people. And basically how it works is, how you can be the best person you can be is balancing four considerations, four priorities, which are culture specific. Like, for example, Kiwis, New Zealanders, place fairness as a foremost value, fairness for all of society. Americans, on the other hand, place freedom, personal freedoms, as most important. How about Filipinos? Well, definitely it's family. Other cultures, or in tandem with the others, faith is the most important, whether it's religion or your ideology. So what is critical if you can balance those four? And again, these are things that I've seen and experienced firsthand in protecting, advancing, and proudly promoting our culture and our people, but also exposure to cultures such as that of New Zealand and America. Then those refer the four outer points of the blue star. And the red part is more, well, actually, this is cut and paste from a framework of life, which you've perhaps seen in the internet. How do you find meaning and purpose in life? It's called ikigai, a Japanese term, by finding meaning and purpose in life if you're able to achieve these four things. Very simply, do what you're good at, do what you like to do what you can be paid for, and do what the world needs. And if you have these 8 points in balance, you become the best person you can be, like a sun, radiating love, light, and goodness for yourself and for everyone. Then finally, next, please. So in 2014, I started a framework in the DFA, a youth engagement platform called the Diplomatic League. And so I was still in Manila from 2014, 2016. We had annual conferences with Philippine students, university and high school, who were interested in diplomacy. So we gave workshops and seminars on facets of diplomacy. And I would like to also announce, and you perhaps know that we're going to have another round of the Foreign Service Officer exam. It doesn't matter what major you have, but in order to take it, you have to have a bachelor's degree, any discipline, but at least 2 years work and or grad school under your belt. And in the Diplomatic League, we also talk about how to best prepare for the exam. So actually many students from UP, not just Diliman, but all campuses have participated. Then we continued, even though I was in New Zealand. And because of COVID, we transferred most of our activities online. And in New Zealand, we developed a framework called the VAMBA, or Volunteer Ambassador, which, one way to put it, it's like, like you have the Laan Kawal, or reservists of the AFP. So the VAMBA, in a way, you could say, are like the reservists of the embassy. But otherwise, it's also how we help you become a track 3 diplomat, how you can really help promote your cause, your community, or commerce as an individual VAMBA in partnership with the embassy and the Global Diplomatic League network. So that's an open invitation to you guys. So that's it. So we'll flash the last slide. Second to the last slide is, to join the DFA, you have to take the FSO exam. And again, we could talk about this more another time. And we'd like to invite you to our online lectures and webinars on this. But if you want to take the Foreign Service Officer exam, which they say is the toughest exam, well, it's tough in the sense that, most people don't really know what to prepare for, because it's not like a board exam. It's not like a nursing or medical or law bar exam. It's not to really test your mastery of a certain profession, but it's actually to test if you can really represent the country, represent the government overseas, if you have a good stock knowledge in various topics, which I'll go over, but also if you can express yourself well in written and in oral form. And the exam has 3 phases. There's a preliminary phase. It's like the civil service exam, but you shouldn't worry. If you manage to pass the UPCAT, you can definitely pass this preliminary exam. But the written exam has these various items. It's over 2 to 3 days, and it's with English, Filipino, foreign language, Philippine conditions, meaning current events, history, culture, so on, world history and current events, international politics and economics. Anyway, the details you find on the DFA website. But thing is, when we don't worry too much about foreign language, it's only 5% of the exam. Filipino is also 5%. English is about 15%, so that's what's checked first. So when we correct the exam, if you don't pass the English part, we don't correct the rest of the exam. Then the oral exam is individual panel interviews, group activities, and the most exciting, but the Waterloo of many who've not passed, is the after-dinner speech of the formal dinner, which rounds out the exam process. So what happens is there's a formal dinner, and we use that to see if you're comfortable in a formal dining setting, which you will encounter in your life as a diplomat. But the key thing is, we should be able to make a speech, a talk on anything under the sun. So the way it works is, at the end of the dinner, it's bunutan. Yung subject mo is by bunutan. So there's so you're called one by one to a lectern at the dinner, where the dinner is being held in the fancy restaurant or in a ballroom. And you make bunot from a bowl of topics. You read the topic, and you have 30 seconds to think, and then boom, you make your speech. You have 3 to 5 minutes. In my time, when I took the exam in 1989, my topic was report on the progress being made on the status of Cambodia within ASEAN. Okay, somebody else's speech was about, okay, you're the Philippine Consul General in Seoul, Korea, and you're celebrating June 12th, and you're making a speech before OFWs and in Korea. So dapat in Filipino. And others would be, you have just been awarded the Order of the Yellow Elephant by the Kingdom of Thailand, and give your acceptance speech. Mga ganon. So how do you best prepare? Again, you should study your lessons very well at UP. also your general education, but also it's your writing ability and your oral expression. So ang mga lamang sa exams are actually writers, journalists, or those in law school. So I was in law school at the time. So the format of answering a law school exam question or the inverted pyramid style of writing an article is perfect for answering foreign service exam questions. Okay, so once you pass, you're guaranteed a job in DFA. You're guaranteed a job. I think, well, so it's more than a board. It's your entry into a wonderful profession. So when you start, you have to be in DFA headquarters for about 2 to 3 years. Then you get posted overseas. When you're posted, you can be in any of the consulates or missions or embassies. You're overseas for 6 years. You can be in one place for 6 years, or you could be transferred, and then you come home for another 2 to 3 years and you're out again, so on and so forth. Okay, so that's really it. The last slide, please. Okay, maraming salamat po. If you have any further questions, that's my email address, and that's a picture of our mural. We commissioned 2016 to celebrate the 50th anniversary of Philippine-New Zealand diplomatic relations. So ngamihi, maraming salamat po.
So thank you, Ambassador Gary, for a very enlightening talk, especially to introduce the diplomatic service to our students. No? Yeah, I remember that yung after dinner speeches are quite difficult. I remember in my German 10 class, and we were one of the activities was a dinner hosted by the German ambassador. Ang nabunot ko is which is the best German sausage.
Did you have to speak in German, bro?
Yeah, it should be in German.
Wow, galing. Oh,
and then that's at the
so
end of the course.
What was your, anong sabi mo? What was your favorite German sausage?
My God, the first na pumasok sa utak ko is Hungarian. That's not diplomatic
Buti hindi Vienna sausage.
Hindi, so I said, natatandaan ko is bratwurst.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, anyway, thank you again. I think we can open the floor for questions. No, this is a very important thing. I think foreign relations is very important. No, it's also for us citizens. So especially we travel abroad. I like to share to the students. Myself and my 2 grad students were caught by the COVID-19 pandemic in Spain. Okay, and that would make us distressed overseas Filipinos kasi we need to rebook our flights because we were informed by the regional government in Galicia that whole country will be shut down. We can't be able to leave, and we can't be in the country for long. We won't have any more euros. So what we did was immediately rush to our embassy in Madrid and talk to one of the embassy people. Call the airline to help us rebook the flight. Tumawag lang sila sa airline, so the airline expected us and immediately rebook our flight. Nakauwi kasi.
Good, yeah.
So that's one of the important roles of our embassies. So when we come into very unusual circumstances, they're always there to help us.
Tama.
So, any questions to Ambassador Domingo? Okay, from the class, especially with respect to the current challenges or the country faces in the world today, especially for COVID-19 and all those things. Any questions from the class? So you can put it in the chat box, then I will read it. Okay, there's a question from Godfrey Taras. Okay, what can you say about New Zealand's COVID response?
Ay nako, you should have attended my earlier lecture. I was invited by the European Studies Association de La Salle precisely on that topic. But anyway, let's pretend this is my after dinner speech. Okay. New Zealand has led in its pandemic response because, most of all, because of its generally good governance, and it's been achieving the top ratings in governance. But specifically, what New Zealand did. So on one hand, people say, well, New Zealand has a small population, 5 million, and it's, kind of out of the thoroughfares of world traffic. It's located very much down under, but that should not diminish New Zealand's excellent management. So I think the most important thing was this establishment of trust between the government and the people. And they talk in terms of teamwork, team of 5 million in tackling COVID. And the Prime Minister, Jacinda Ardern, she's an excellent communicator, very strong sense of empathy. And so she would appear on TV very frequently, sometimes almost daily, to assure the public that the government's doing the best it can. And she's accompanied by Dr. Ashley Bloomfield, who is the chief executive of the New Zealand Health Ministry. So they had early lockdown, very clear and decisive early lockdown. They administered a strict quarantine regime for those who have flown from overseas. They had very good contract tracing. They had a very simple and clear protocols on lockdowns. And but really, I think it's a sense of trust and the sense of cooperation and compassion that led the government's efforts in combating COVID. Yeah, that in a nutshell is why New Zealand has done very well.
Yeah, and I think just to add to that, New Zealand is a working government science advice system. Myself and Dr. Butch Ong, the other professor in STS and also with the DOH, we trained under the New Zealand Science Advisor, Sir Peter Gluckman. So the modules that we're using in class for STS.
Wow, that's great.
Is actually from the modules that Sir Peter actually wrote, no? So
let me take note of that. Yeah, they'd love to hear that. Yeah.
So STS classes are using some of the learning modules for to look at development and science advice. That's from the New Zealand Science Advisor.
Yeah. Okay. Great.
So, any other questions from the class? Please put it on the chat box. If you don't want to. Oh, maybe it's Friday afternoon.
Yeah.
We have a lot of time we have around 10 minutes for questions pa, okay? So don't hesitate.
Yeah.
Won't anyone ask about ano bang biggest biggest concern at the moment with respect to our foreign relations for the students? What do you think?
Dr. Butch Ong is here. Hey, Brad, kumusta?
Butch, where are you? Kanina nandiyan na. Yeah.
Hi, Brad. Good afternoon. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Wala nang questions. Let me roll the ball again. Ambassador Gary, you've been talking about you refocusing putting some focus on our the Pacific Island nations kasi a few Filipinos are familiar with them, no? I think for most of us, the Pacific Islands would start and end with Guam, but beyond that, hindi na natin alam. Okay.
Okay.
Guam is an American territory. So, can you give us more about your advocacy for the Pacific Islands, cultural and our strengthening?
Oh, okay, great question. Thank you, Prof. Well, actually, so my alma mater in UP is Asian Center. So I'm helping them develop the Pacific Studies program. And hopefully we can transform the Asia Center to be the Asia Pacific Center. And it's very important because I've come to this conclusion that, and it will be in my forthcoming book, Way of the Sun, is that in coming to New Zealand, I realized really that we are by core, we're not really Asian, we're Pacific Islander, we are Austronesian. And that will explain a lot. We have so much in common. But, again, the Maori, the Katatubo of New Zealand, they migrated centuries ago from either Taiwan or South China through Luzon. And the evidence is quite clear in language, with the Maori and other, especially the Polynesians, you see the linguistic commonality. The word for 5, sa atin, 5, sa kanila, 5. But the Samoans and Tongans are actually even closer. Their word for 5 is also 5. You look at also social organization. It's very barangay, katulad natin. And how the tribes, the settlements was equivalent of like, so, our basic unit is the barangay, which started from balangay. They have the same thing. What they called balangay was waka. And when they trace their ancestry, their family trees, they say, oh, well, which waka did you come from? You look at the art. You look at, okay, see this mural, see this Filipina and the Maori. That can pass for Cordilleran, di ba? So it's, knowing about the Pacific is knowing more about ourselves, especially now that we are observing the quincentennial. Remember, when 500 years ago, that was the start of our colonization. But if we want to discover, but the problem still is, or the challenge rather, is rediscovering yung sariling atin. And I think you have a lot of what we used to have very much alive in the Pacific. So the Pacific is important because it's rediscovering ourselves.
Yeah, I think that's right though, because yeah, I did my doctoral work on shells. And so
Yeah.
on mollusks, no, and yung marine biology of mollusks. Anyway, so some of the what I learned when I looked at the museum material in Australia, and also I went to New Zealand, and that's what's a
Great.
memorable thing, because the sticker of my Australian visa fell, so I had to run to the Australian High Commission to have it restock again. Natanggal siya.
Okay. What was your PhD discipline again in?
Marine biology. I did it in.
Oh yeah, cool. Yes, great.
So anyway, one of the things there I learned from yung large shells, yung sa atin kasi that is yung giant clam, taklobo yung ating malaking shell. I think taklobo is indigenous to the Philippines, no. But the smaller shells, yung smaller giant clams, so if there's such a thing. Actually there's such a thing, yung medyo mas maliit ng konti. Ang tawag natin doon ay kima, especially for the Visayas, no, and Mindoro. Pero sa Pacific Islands, sa Marshall Islands, Fiji, iba-ibang version ng kima. Kima, gima, they call it almost the same. So cultural relationship by using of these giant clams for
wow, great,
links us. And also yung bahay ni Nemo, which is a sea anemone. Ang tawag sa kanya sa Mindoro ay kibot. Now, I found out from a Phrygian friend na gibot pala sa kanila yun. So
wow.
There's a relationship, no? Kibot yan sa Oriental Mindoro and gibot in Fiji. Bahay ni Nemo or the sea anemone.
Wow.
Proves na yung cultural links natin were in the past, and I think we need to strengthen it, no? So Gary, how many Filipinos are in the Cook Islands? Kasi I read on your social media posts na you always go to the Cook Islands. Marami ba tayong nationals in the Cook Islands?
Oh, not about less than 100 in Cook Islands. That's a very small place. But
and
yeah.
Most of them are what do they kanilang the work in the Cook Islands?
Oh, iba-iba. Some are working in the, well, I guess the biggest employer for Pinoys I see there are in the tourism and hospitality industry, working in hotels. Some are working as, I found a good friend there who's a graphic designer. Some are in clerical management roles. So iba-iba, but most regarding the tourism industry. Interestingly, in the other Pacific islands like Fiji, Samoa, Tonga, many are actually mananahi. So we've developed a Philippine, mananahi seamstresses. So we've been, even so the king of Tonga proudly talks about his suits, or the queen, done by Filipino seamstresses.
So they're making the clothes for the royal family in Tonga.
Yeah. Oh. And then the top doctor, the top medical doctor in Fiji, our honorary consul, is so medical field. He's there. Dr. Diasa, who's our honorary consul general in Fiji. So he's the doctor of choice for the government and the UN agencies there. So we're quite very well respected, very well represented. But in New Zealand, we're particularly prominent. Well, we have 80,000. But the ones who are, and actually, one thing I forgot to mention, the reason why New Zealand has such great COVID management is because we have Filipino nurses. And, even the governor of mayor of New York, the prime minister of the UK had singled out Filipino nurses for praise as frontliners in the combat against the global pandemic. And here in New Zealand too, we're quite prominent also in farming. So in time, Filipinos will come to own a lot of the farms that's supplying us with all this anchor butter coming back to the Philippines. And many are in IT, many are in construction. And I'm glad to point out that, Filipino youth, Filipino Kiwi youth, a lot of them are the valedictorians or the heads of student government in many of the New Zealand high schools. So we're quite, and in recent time, the only full-blooded or Filipino-born person who was able to get into the national legislature was MP Paulo Garcia, who was actually my long-lost UP Law classmate. He made it into the parliament. And there has never been a full-blooded or Filipino-born person who've made it in the US Congress, Senate, or House. Yeah, at the state level, but not federal. The only other countries where we had such an achievement was Canada. Someone was elected, Dr. Pagtakhan in Winnipeg. There was an appointed senator in Ontario, and there was an appointed MP in Seoul, Korea. But this was some time ago. So New Zealand is really one of the best countries, if not the best country, for migrants, not just Filipino, but all migrants. Unfortunately, it's because it started to get so popular, even before COVID, medyo humigpit ang migration. But so those who made it in are very fortunate. Now, the salaries may not be as high as, say, the US or Australia, but the overall quality of life can't be beat.
In New Zealand, yeah.
Very,
it's
so
very laid back. So
yeah,
even more,
very
more
casual, compassionate.
A little bit more laid back than Australia. If Australia is laid back, mas laid back yung Kiwi.
Yeah.
Yeah, and also again, this should interest our students. You opportunities for Filipino students to study in New Zealand. If there are scholarships and
you have to be because of COVID, major Domingo, but that's globally. But once it's open again, there are I believe 24 scholarships, graduate scholarships, and there's actually most advantageous if you apply for PhD, because there are fewer people apply for PhD. Plus, the support to PhD scholarships, it's not just the government, but also the individual universities. So and especially those of you who are science majors, talagang there's some of the majors are more sought after. So yeah, and then after you get your scholarship, you're just expected to work for X number of years back in the Philippines. So yeah, it's a great, fantastic deal. You can also pay on your own, but be very careful that if you want to go on your own, that's fine too. I mean, first try the scholarships. Try to avoid going through these education advisors or immigration agents. You don't need them. You can apply directly to schools, so you save on the fees that immigration or education advisors charge for going to New Zealand. But yeah, I'd be again very happy to talk more on that on other occasions. And if you join us in the Diplomatic League, then Brad Butch, your son Inso, is very active from UP Baguio in our Diplomatic League, as you well know.
So sumali kayo sa Diplomatic League. Also, just to add on to the scholarship, yung kasama ko sa Australia sa PhD program, si Dr. Brian Stockwell is teaching in Fiji. Okay. may scholarship daw pala for Filipinos to go to Fiji, but nobody has taken it on. So baka
Oh my God! Yeah,
sa
you should look
marine,
at that. Yeah,
marine and
yeah.
environmental science and engineering. So baka
Mm.
one of the students here may be interested, no? Hindi ako nakapunta ng Fiji eh. Nung pupunta ako, nagkaroon ng cyclone. So hindi ko na
Okay.
na-reschedule.
Uh,
So hindi na ako natuloy. I still had an invite to go. Kaya na pandemic na and all of these things, no, from
mm.
Dr. Stockwell. Ayan, so you may try to consider, you may also try to consider studying in or doing your PhD in Fiji sa University of the South Pacific nga ba yun, Gary?
Yeah, yeah.
They have a nice program there in marine and environmental science, so you may choose, no? Fiji is a nice country, and daming
Beautiful, beautiful country. Yeah.
Yeah. Are there any more other comments, questions to Ambassador Gary? It's almost 5:30 and yeah, ito may isa pa from Kervin Manzano. Ano po sa tingin nyo mangyayari sa relationship ng countries in terms of scientific policies in the next few years after the pandemic? So Gary, what are the relationships in terms of science policies?
Oh my God, that's well. There's going to be so much information, so much data that was generated, which will preoccupy lifetimes. But also, very importantly, we've had so many lessons learned on how to prevent the next pandemic. So definitely, there's going to be a huge boost in international, country-to-country, whole-of-world study on pandemic, on global health security. But also, we should not also forget, even without the pandemic, we're facing crisis in terms of climate change, rising sea levels, rising temperatures. And, literally some of the Pacific Island countries are disappearing. So one of my jobs is to work with the Pacific Islands Forum, but it's like the ASEAN of Pacific. They just launched this a global resilience facility where they're appealing for assistance to adapt and mitigate effects of climate change. That's a $1.5 billion project. So yeah, there's lots of opportunities already to be science diplomats, not necessarily from DFA, but as as hard science researchers and academics through UP or other institutions. So yeah, there will be a lot of science diplomacy, lot of science cooperation after the pandemic.
Yeah, and I think I would agree to that because we get emails from Sir Peter Gluckman.
Great.
Science advisor. He's now with the International Science Council.
Right.
There will be more networking, no? Kasi ang nangyari sa pandemic is nakita naman ng global community that certain countries are lagging in their capacities and some countries have their capacity. So there will be more networking to ensure everybody gets leveled up.
Right.
There'll be more exchanges, no? But and all of them will be probably done by Zoom until we really solve the pandemic.
Yeah. Right.
So if you get invited to a conference, let's say I was invited to Nepal, but that's by Zoom. So I just saw the picture of Mount Everest while attending the conference. So wala naman ng air travel until we solve this problem, no? But there'll be more networking. So there's another question from Kyle Torrejos, no? About the scholarship, do we have to go to DOST or are New Zealand schools offering the scholarships to Filipinos directly? I think that's what he meant.
Oh yeah, you look at the New Zealand Embassy website or just Google New Zealand scholarships, boom. But I think DOST has another series of scholarships, so look at both. But the ones coming for New Zealand, funded by the New Zealand government, you go directly to the New Zealand Embassy website. If you have problems, you could just contact me directly or through Professor Ben, if you have any difficulties.
Thank you, sir.
Yeah, also, UP gets these scholarship announcements from the different embassies, no? And that will get posted in the UP website. Or kung medyo nahuhuli siya, maybe what you can do is, the students can do is email the college secretary kasi siya yung
Yeah.
nag-ano information na yan. And yeah, email the college secretary. So nandun yung
Yeah.
mga details on the scholarship, or better yet, yun nga. Or another another thing that you can do is to write the International Students Office of the New Zealand's universities and ask what are the scholarship opportunities for Filipinos. They would reply. Sabihin nila kung ano yung
Yeah.
ano. Doon ko nalaman yung sa Fiji kasi finorward sa akin yung may scholarship pala for Filipinos to do PhDs in Fiji for 2 students. But they have walang takers. Yun. So, suppose. You may try.
Yeah.
Okay, so it's almost 5:30. I think we have to wrap up, no? So Gary, do you have any final words to say to our students?
Yeah, I think, well, again, let's not lose hope. I think God only gives us challenges that we can meet. But otherwise, yeah, I hope this is just the beginning of a closer relationship between Embassy Diplomatic League with ISCO and ISCA from, well, particularly from the Science College of Science and the Science majors through Professor Ben. So yeah, you want to invite me anytime, and I'll also share with you announcements of our Diplomatic League activities. And again, I've left my email address. So if there's any particular questions you have regarding New Zealand or Pacific, I'm just email away. So Ngamihi, maraming salamat po, and it's a great honor and privilege to share with you today. Thanks to Prof. Ben for this opportunity.
Yung copy yung slides the Ambassador Domingo is uploaded into our Uvle site. So if you want, you can download it from there. Okay, and the recording I will also upload it once when it's processed. Okay.
Okay, great.